right, welcome to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where I'm very, very happy that my co-host Gordon McCormick from Breaking History, which I think everybody here has watched at least a few times, has well, he's gonna do something very important. And I'm saying this because a lot of people still find it very curious and confusing how a nation such as Saudi Arabia, which we know has been a part of very bad things for many decades, has been able to carry out a qualitative shift in its character, its identity, and its sense of national purpose within a broader geopolitical, geoeconomic chemistry. How did that happen? What are the dynamics shaping that entire region? And since this whole, as Gordon has made the point, that this terminology of the sovereign alliance, Russia, China, Iran, to a certain degree North Korea, but Saudi Arabia has increasingly played a very positive role in defending the institution of the sovereign nation state and the idea of civilizational forces, that there's more than the simple sovereign nation state at play, but rather civilizational identities, which transcends all of that. That goes back to processes that are thousands of years old, that are very, very sacred, and that carry with them both universal truths about human nature, about the nature of God, universal law, natural law, some call it, and inversely also have seeds of corruption and folly embedded everywhere. So nobody is without taint, nobody is without sin in this game. So it's important to see where does wisdom emerge. So Gordon has really immersed himself in a study that has impressed me immensely over the past few years that he's been doing this. I've only been working with Gordon for about a year. But again, I've been very blown away. So again, Gordon, thank you so much for doing this. Like usual, after your formal remarks are finished, we're going to open up for some dialogue. So everybody just pop in your name into the chat box like usual, and you'll get a chance to share a thought, pose a question to Gordon, and we'll go from there. So Gordon, it's all yours.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me again. Pleasure to be here. And yes, as Matt said, Matt and I have been discussing this for about a year, although I think we've really dug more into it in the past few months, but certainly on Badlands Media, where Breaking History is hosted, we've been discussing this for a few years now, kind of going back to Burning Bright, who's the editor of our Substack, wrote an article prophetically, really, in January of 2022 called Righteous Russia, just a few weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, just by happenstance. And it was a 10-part series. It's a great series. I encourage everyone to go read it. And the opening article of that series, he is comparing, without directly saying so until the end of the article, he's comparing the treatment of President Trump with the treatment of Vladimir Putin in the Western media, and how they're basically treated the exact same. And that led to him, doing some of his own digging, not necessarily from a historical academic standpoint, although he does go into a little bit of history, but just really more from like a storytelling narrative standpoint, being a fiction author. That's his background. And so he kind of came up with the idea of, came up with the terminology of the sovereign alliance. And I was doing my own research at the time. I really didn't become familiar with his work until the summer of 2022. And then we have linked up since then and been working together. But I was doing my own research for many, many years. And I believe I've been on here with you before, Matt, and we discussed a little bit about the history of Saudi Arabia and what got me into it. But just for those who haven't seen that, briefly, I'll just say that really it was the sword dance when Trump visited there. And what really struck me about that, because I was somebody who prior to the presidency of Donald Trump did buy into sort of the more like neocon propaganda that Islam was a problem and it was something that we were going to have to confront, probably kinetically as Westerners, and there was going to be some sort of a showdown between Christianity and Islam. And I've since, of course, educated myself tremendously and really learned that radical Islamic terrorism, much like every other form of terrorism in the world, is really a creation of the Western intelligence network. So with all that said, that really, when Donald Trump, going from, the rhetoric that he was using in his candidacy for the presidency in 2016, where he was being branded as Islamophobic, and he was going to go to war with the Islamic world and all that kind of stuff, and keep Muslims from immigrating to America, at least according to the media. And then really just did this full 180-degree shift and went to Saudi Arabia as his first destination on his global tour. And then was welcomed like a conquering hero and given the sword dance. That's really what led me down the rabbit hole of what is actually going on here. And what I learned is that this guy, Mohammed bin Salman, who is now effectively the sovereign, he's the crown prince, but his father, the king, who made him crown prince 1 month after Donald Trump visited. Before that, he was just the defense minister and considered a deputy crown prince, which I believe there's many of those. He was then made crown prince, replacing a guy named Mohammed bin Naif, who I believe is either his cousin. I think it's a cousin or maybe a distant uncle. But Naif was basically like a shill for the CIA. He was somebody who had really, really deep ties to the CIA and MI6. And when he was replaced in kind of a dramatic palace coup of sorts, even though it was the king, MBS's father, who did it, that really caused a huge ripple effect in the West, because this guy who was so loyal to the CIA for so long with such deep ties to them was being replaced by this much younger guy in his 30s who nobody had really heard of. According to the CIA's own mouthpieces, Ben Hubbard, who wrote a book in 2020 called MBS, like The Rise of MBS, which is a great book to read because he actually does a really good job of going and collecting data and interviewing people and getting kind of this story, but like the biography, at least according to the people around MBS, as it's being reported by him. Now he is twisting the data to present this nefarious character that wants to basically take over the world and be this really bad actor. But as we've seen in the past few years, that's not really the case, especially post October 7th. We've really seen MBS be the guy, and excuse me, my computer, I'm sorry, no, computer's fine. I thought I was about to die. We've really seen MBS after October 7th be the guy to summon the entire Muslim world of Riyadh and told everyone to stand by and not to attack. And I think that was something that on the day of October 7th, I appeared on Devolution Power Hour, which is kind of the flagship program on Badlands. And they had me on there to kind of pick my brain over what had happened in Israel. And my prediction there was that MBS was going to do that. He was going to summon the whole Muslim world and stop World War III from happening. And there were a lot of skeptics when I said that, but I'm pleased to see that it's actually what has played out, because it's a signal to me that these musings and thoughts and theories that we've been developing for quite some time, there's more to it than just blind optimism or biased research or biased biased confirmation. So if we kind of back up a little bit, really the two big things that really were indicative to me that MBS was something very different, or the three things rather. The first being, according to Ben Hubbard, who is a New York Times writer who's put out a lot of propaganda about specific issues, specifically against Saudi Arabia and against the Middle East, and trying to generate this animosity in the West towards the Middle East. According to him, and he's been very sympathetic and pro CIA in his writings, he says that in 2013, because his father, King Salman, was appointed crown prince by his brother, who was then the king, King Abdullah, in 2011. 2011, 2012, he was appointed crown prince, which put him in line to become king when Abdullah passed away. So in 2013, he then made his son one of MBS, like one of his top advisors. MBS was following him to all these meetings, taking diligent notes, and all these people from the State Department started to notice this. And they said at the time, I think he just turned 39. So at the time he would have been, about 28 in his late 20s. And they were like, who is this young guy? We have no idea who this guy is. According to Ben Hubbard, they didn't even have a file on him at that point because he was such an unknown prince. He wasn't supposed to be anyone of consequence. He's not very high up, or wasn't very high up in terms of the monthly stipends that they give out from the PIF. The PIF gives out anywhere from, I think it's $250,000 to about $600, depending on who you are in the Saudi royal family. That's like their monthly allowance. And he was on the lower half of that, as I understand it. So he was not somebody who was considered of great consequence in his upbringing, but he was always very pro-Saudi. He chose, after his two half-brothers died who were in their 40s, who were very, very well known in the West because they were, one of them was really into horse racing and won the Kentucky Derby a few times. The other one was somebody who met with the media back during Desert Storm when America used Saudi Arabia as their staging ground to go into Kuwait, Iraq rather. He was somebody who really met with the media and spoke to them really often. And so because of that, the Western forces, so to speak, became very familiar with these two guys. And they both passed away within, I think, a year and a half of one another, right around the time of 9/11. It was very hard on their father. He took it very serious, like very, very, it devastated him. And MBS decided to not go to school in Europe. He decided not to go to school, boarding school in Europe or America, which is what every one of his half brothers and cousins did. He decided to stay home and take care of his father and stick by him and make sure he was okay. Which is, to me, that says a lot about character quality. And I try to use that in my analysis of individuals when I'm looking at their behavior and their conduct and what their motivations might be. The other thing that really, so I said there were three things. The first was that the CIA had no idea who this guy was. Like, that's very obvious based on their mouthpieces talking about him. And you can tell when you look at the way that the Western media talks about him and how they villainize him. It's very similar to how they treat Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. The other thing is that right around that time, 9/11, the way that Ben Hubbard tells it, even Ben Hubbard, and now he's interviewing other people, so this is their words, but according to them, what they're saying is that MBS took 9/11 very, very hard. He was 16 years old when it happened. His mother calls him into the room after the first plane hits, and he watches the second plane hit the tower, and his immediate response was, like when they were talking about when they were talking about radical Islamic terrorism, he said, the world is going to come after us. And that was even before, apparently, they found the 19 passports that night in the wreckage. And then, of course, it was on after that. And you can see now that they have blamed Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the scapegoat. And he vowed at that point, he vowed to seek vengeance on all the people who were involved in doing that and framing his family for doing it. Now, to your point, Matt, what you had said in the introduction, there have been some very nefarious members of the royal family who've been deeply involved in the CIA, Mohammed bin Naif being one of them. Alawi bin Talal being another. Alawi bin Talal, for those who don't know, was the primary shareholder in Twitter back when Twitter was a thing. He was a big investor in Time Warner, CNN. I think he was the number one donor before George Soros. He was the number one donor of the Democrat Party at one point. Very close with the Clintons, the Bushes, all the typical, the usual actors. And of course, he was like the highest profile person who was rounded up during the Saudi royal purge. So that's the other thing, is that after you see the sword dance happen, that's May of 2017, June of 2017, MBS becomes crown prince. And then in November of 2017, his father, King Salman, summons the entire Muslim world. It's called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It's 57 nations, representing basically 2 billion people, a third of the world's population, the entire Muslim world. It's all the leaders from that organization coming from those nations coming together in Riyadh. That's who MBS summoned right after October 7th and told them all to stand down. And King Salman does that. He invites everyone over to Riyadh November 4th, 2017. And when they all get in the room, he says, look, I just wanted to let everyone know that I'm basically advocating the throne. My son, the crown prince, is now basically king. You can just consider him sovereign. Everyone's going to continue to call King Salman king until he dies. And he is very widely respected inside and outside the Muslim world for a number of reasons. But he said, MBS is in charge. Everyone listen to him. And the first thing MBS says is, I've created a corruption panel that is meeting right now, and they're going to start um, implementing justice on my behalf against all the corruption in my country. And immediately everyone starts getting arrested that day and rounded up. Alaouid bin Talal being one of them, Mohammed bin Naif being another one. A number of the other cousins are all, these are all people who were funding ISIS, who were behind 9/11, who were involved in all the really bad things that we've heard and read about that really made Saudi Arabia the villain in a lot of ways. But really, it was just rogue actors, much like the rogue actors we have here in the West and in the United States and other places. So that, when you see that happen, those are really, really encouraging signs. The other thing that he did is that in 2 months before that, September 2017, he starts rounding up all of the radical Islamic clerics from the Saudi government. There were roughly about, I think, 4,700 of them, 4,800 of them in the government. 750 of them get arrested, and then the other 4,000 that maybe weren't guilty of crimes are just dismissed and expelled from the government. So all of the radical Wahhabi clerics are all expelled. That's a very encouraging sign, of course. And so you really see this pivot away from radical Islam and towards something more moderate. And we've seen that actually get implemented. If you look up the charter of I think it's the Declaration of Mecca in 2019, and it's like a 30-point document, 30 bullet points that talks about how all three religions are going to be tolerated in Saudi. They're going to move away from terrorism. Terrorism will not be tolerated. And there's this really, really great line in there. I think it's the 5th bullet point or the 6th bullet point, where they talk about how all the sins of the past, none of us were alive for all those sins. All the killing that happened in the past, all of the bad things that were done, not only in the name of Allah, but also in the name of God or the name of other endeavors. We were not alive for that. So we shouldn't blame ourselves, blame each other, or hold grudges. We need to move past that. And as an American, looking at what happened in the summer of 2020, when they were tearing down all the statues and talking about how evil all of the figures from American history are, that really resonated with me. I thought that that should resonate with all Americans who believe in freedom and believe in what America is really supposed to be, because we saw the same thing happen with that color revolution, where they were trying to villainize all the founding fathers and talk about how evil they were because of some of their sins. And so I thought it was really important with the Declaration of Mecca, or the Mecca Declaration, I think is what it's called. I thought that was really, really important. Excuse me. So what really led to this purge, this Saudi purge that I learned, again, from Ben Hubbard, I thought he provided some great data. And I confirmed this through a few other sources that talked about it as well. And this is kind of obscure information, but apparently in February of 2015, when King Abdullah dies, he then brings in his son. I mean, I'm sorry, his brother Salman becomes king. He appoints Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, defense minister, and Naif becomes crown prince. And I think that actually was a smart move, because it kind of put the CIA in a more passive situation where they were in a holding pattern, where they're like, all right, we got our guy is next in line. So I think that probably allowed them to sit back a little bit, and it bought some time for MBS to do what he needed to do. He immediately summons his 4 top advisors, which would be his 2 brothers and his 2 cousins, into a room. He locks the doors and he says, we have a problem, and nobody's leaving this room until we come up with a plan to fix it. And the problem is that the PIF, the Public Investment Fund, was set to become insolvent in 2 years at the end of 2017. And the reason was, so the PIF is a $800 billion basically trust fund that comes from Aramco, comes from the oil money. And they used that not only to pay out the allowances to all the royal family members, but also to fund the entire government. The entire Saudi government is funded from the PIF, and their annual budget, I believe, is $400 billion for the government, or maybe just for the PIF in general. And they were hemorrhaging about $80 to $100 billion a year, as I understand it. And it was so bad, and that was because of redundancies, that was because of corruption, embezzlement, all the stuff you would expect to find maybe in like the American budget, like any budget of any government around the world. But the problem with them is that it was a self-sustaining fund and it was about to go insolvent. And so in 12 hours, they came up with a plan to basically tear down the entire government on paper and then rebuild it back up. So in 10 days later, again, this is late January 2015, they tore down the entire government in 10 days and then rebuilt it in two columns, one column being security and military and the other column being the economy. And so everything in the Saudi government now is organized on those two principles. And they streamlined everything. So everything, I mean, it's probably still a work in progress, but that's how they basically saved Saudi Arabia from collapsing. And what I think probably would have happened is the PIF would have gone insolvent. The individual family members would have still had whatever wealth they had acquired. But there wouldn't have been a Saudi government anymore. And that would have allowed, the bin Ladens or some other family, rival family to step in and basically take control. And it probably would have led to Saudi Arabia, like a civil war or whatever into Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia would be completely irrelevant at this point as a geopolitical force. And I think that was probably a plan. That was probably a nefarious plan that would have allowed Iran to step in and become the leader of the Middle East and impose its will in the Middle East. And at that point, Iran was obviously being propped up by the Obama administration. And so I think that a real crisis was averted by MBS by doing that. And then I also think that's part of the reason that he rounded up all his corrupt cousins, not only because they were involved in 9/11 and ISIS and other things, but because I think they probably were the ones who had cooked the books to basically that set up Saudi Arabia to collapse. And so they were able to subvert that. So I kind of I think, Matt, it makes a lot of sense here to explain the history of where a lot of this stuff comes from. So everyone's aware at this point of RFK Jr. and that big moment that we saw about a month ago where RFK Jr. and Donald Trump, maybe it was a month and a half ago, RFK Jr. and Donald Trump come together. They put aside their differences. They come together. RFK gets behind Trump, brings a big, left-wing Democrat contingent with him. And they kind of complete what I've been calling horseshoe theory, which is the idea that the populist left and the populist right are going to put aside their differences and come together and unite against the corrupt uniparty in the middle, right? And that's exactly what that represents. Now, I think what that actually is, and this is what Nicole Shanahan, who was RFK's vice presidential candidate, she's been putting these really great videos out on her X account that really emphasizes the fact that what RFK Jr. is doing right now is he is, quote unquote, finishing the story of his uncle and his father, of JFK and RFK Sr. And that story, I think, is the purging of the CIA from the U.S. government and everything that the CIA has come to represent, which is a much larger, in my opinion, criminal cartel that's probably transnational in nature. Israel, I think, is a big part of that. There was this thing between, let me share my screen here. Okay, so if you can see my screen, Matt, this came out with the JFK, like part of the JFK files, the disclosure that we've seen in the past few years. One of the big things that came out was the day before JFK was inaugurated, he met with Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, as it explains right here, warned Kennedy that the biggest problem that he was going to deal with, probably geopolitically, aside from Russia and the Cold War, of course, was the Israeli nuclear program. There was an illegal nuclear program that Israel was setting up with the help of France. France was helping them establish this nuclear program. And JFK was going to have to work against not only Israel, but the forces within the U.S. government that were helping Israel do that. Because Israel had, of course, infiltrated the U.S. government. And so he immediately embarks on that. It really picks up steam in 1963. And you have what's called the War of the Letters, the Battle of the Letters. And that was when JFK and David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli prime minister, who was the original Israeli prime minister when the state was created in 1948, were exchanging correspondence over the nuclear program. And basically, when these inspectors were being sent over to Israel to look at the facility, they were being denied access. And what access they were being given, it was very, very limited, and they were obviously hiding things. And that made JFK livid. And he was trying to explain to Ben-Gurion that, if you embark on this, if you continue down this path, all you're doing is establishing a precedence for all of your neighbors to do the exact same thing. You're going to see every other neighbor defy, the international order, like the international organizations that try to prevent this stuff. And they're going to go after and develop their own nukes. And that's going to lead to nuclear war. So you need to stop doing this and come out into the sunlight and let us, resolve this in the public square. And they were basically thumbed their nose at him and said, absolutely not, pound sand. And so he writes he wrote like a very famous 7-page letter to Ben-Gurion in 1963 explaining all that, and was basically told to pound sand. And this actually leads to Ben-Gurion resigning. This whole scandal leads to him resigning and ends his career, his term as Israeli prime minister. But it really does highlight what ends up happening later, because later you get what's called the Apollo affair, which is where about 600 kilograms of highly enriched nuclear material goes missing from a facility in the Parks Township of Pennsylvania in 1965. And it gets transferred to Israel, along with a bunch of trigger switches and other materials that you would use to build a bomb. And in the 70s, we know now because of a guy named Mordecai Vanunu, who was an Israeli scientist who defected in 1985. He goes public, and he has photographs of the facility that he worked in. He has all the information, all the particulars, and is explaining that this is all true. All of this actually happened. Israel does have probably about 200 nuclear weapons, and it's a real problem. And he said, this is something that's going to lead to the destruction of the world if we're not careful. And that's why he came out and went public with it. He was later kidnapped in Italy by the Mossad, brought home, faced a secret trial behind closed doors, and was put in solitary confinement, I believe, for 16 years. I think he was released in 2008, and basically has lived under lock and key as on probation in Israel ever since. And it just really goes to show, how nefarious all this is and how deep this all goes. So if you look at the presidency of Donald Trump, his alliance with RFK Jr. as the quote unquote finishing the story of JFK and everything he was trying to do, which not only was taking down the CIA and the nefarious intelligence apparatus within the U.S. government, but also Israel and everything it has kind of come to represent from a nefarious standpoint. You also have sorry, I lost my place here. MBS and what he represents. And so let me explain real quick what he represents. He represents the same thing, but from the Saudi side. And so you had this guy in Saudi Arabia, and I'll just share this tab, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. And so he was the king from 1964 until 1975, replacing his older brother, Saud. And so Saud was the first king of Saudi Arabia after the original. This would be King Abdulaziz. And so King Abdulaziz was the guy who founded Saudi Arabia with the help of British intelligence in the 1930s. And so he actually creates the original Saudi Arabia. He's the founder of the modern state of Saudi Arabia. And he's in power for about 20 years. He dies in the 1950s. And his oldest son, Saud, takes over. Saud is kind of incompetent. He's not a very good ruler. And after about 11 years of being in power, his brothers all decide that he has to go because they depose him. They don't kill him or anything. They just depose him because, he is leading them down a bad path. And so he was replaced by Faisal in 1964. So Faisal is important because in 1961, he actually meets in private secretly with JFK. And we learned this again from the JFK files. But he actually met secretly on October 5th, 1962 at the White House. And I just went and asked Perplexity to just give me the bullet points on this. But this is something that I've read about many times in many different places. And they had this meeting. And this is, at this point, I believe he's the crown prince. So he's not the king yet. And they met in secret for a number of reasons, optics and all that stuff for both sides. But Kennedy gives him a lot of advice about what he should do to really make Saudi Arabia a great country, versus just kind of this broker for oil, where you have this really rich ruling class, like ruling family, that rules over kind of just a peasantry almost, which is what the Saudi people were at that point. And he says, he gives him all this advice, and later, actually, after he's killed and Faisal comes into power in 64, he implements a 10-point plan, which a lot of those points come from his meeting with JFK. One of the points being abolish slavery. So he abolishes slavery because slavery was still legal at that point. He implements a plan to provide health care to the people, economic programs to try to give people a leg up, to actually establish a middle class, better relations with the United States, to allow Navy ships to visit Saudi ports, the civic action program, like road building projects, that would benefit the U.S. military, but also the Saudi military. So there are a number of things that he does when he works with Faisal. And the whole idea that I think Kennedy instills in him is, look, if you want to be a great country, you have to have a great people. And that's something that Kennedy, I think, talked about as the American president. It's important for a country to be great. Its people have to be great. It's not enough for them just to have a country to have a great leader. It has to have a great people behind that leader. And if Faisal was able to give that to his people, not only will they venerate him for it, but they will then be able to stand on their own 2 feet, and they'll laud the entire Saudi royal family and say, what a great thing you've done for us, the same way the founding fathers did that for the American people. So, of course, that leads to you start to see this prosperity start to develop in the 1960s, the later 1960s in Saudi Arabia. At the same time, you have some really nefarious forces in the West who are tinkering in the Middle East. And we see in I think it was 68 or 69, the French president asks for to exchange his dollars for gold. That leads to Nixon taking the U.S. dollar off the gold standard in 1971. And then in 1973, you have Israel engaged in the Yom Kippur War, which leads to the oil crisis. And that was when Saudi Arabia said everyone who's supporting Israel in this, which would be the U.S., Canada, Japan, Australia, Britain, a few other countries, they no longer are going to get oil from us. We're going to stop selling oil to them immediately. And for 6 months, I think it was, Saudi didn't sell us any oil, and there was gas rationing in America, and I think prices went up 300% overnight, and it was called the oil crisis. And so that is resolved when Henry Kissinger, of all people, who was the Secretary of State under Nixon in early 1974, goes to Saudi Arabia, meets with King Faisal, and negotiates the petrodollar deal, what would be called the petrodollar deal. And the way he does that is he says, look, what we want you to do is we want you to sell oil in only U.S. dollars, which was going to then require every country in the world to maintain their own reserve of U.S. dollars. And in exchange, we're going to protect you. The U.S. military is going to protect you from Israel, and you're not going to have to worry about security because we're going to have your back. And I'm sure from Faisal's standpoint, what choice did he have? If he said no, the U.S. military was probably going to invade Saudi Arabia, right? So he agrees to it. He signs the deal. Henry Kissinger comes home and almost immediately resigns from the Nixon administration because, as he puts it, that was when Watergate was unfolding in 1974. And he then rides off into the sunset. At that point, the year before, 1973, he had dispatched Zbigniew Brzezinski to create the Trilateral Commission. He had also dispatched in 1971 Klaus Schwab to create the World Economic Forum. So you start seeing these organizations that are now a really big problem being created and then going off and basically plotting to take over the world. That's what they were doing. The globalist schemes, as we now know them. And so he leaves Secretary of State position and then goes to join Brzezinski and Klaus Schwab and all those guys to take on the globalist agenda. The other thing that happens is at that time, you see Iran, the Shah in Iran, starts speaking out against Zionism and speaking out against Israel. And that ultimately leads to him being overthrown in 1979, probably by the CIA, who, by the way, installed him in 1952 because his predecessor tried to nationalize the British oil in Iran and make it for the benefit of the Iranian people. And they weren't going to allow that, which is why you get this pro-West, pro-open society leader in the Shah. And, you know, Tehran was a great city at that point in the 1970s before the, indistinguishable from any other Western city, really, in terms of women's ability to work, go to college, and not be typically, the oppression that you now see in that part of the world. So they get overthrown. The CIA installs them, and as MBS has explained, that is a fulcrum, like a major inflection point, turning point in the Middle East, because what you see happen from there is you see this kind of arms race of ideology between the Shia in Iran, and that's where Shia Islam is really based out of, is Iran, and then Sunni, which is based really out of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia also being the homeland of Islam itself. And the idea was who could be the most orthodox. Is it the Sunni or is it the Shia? And that leads to both cultures then banning movie theaters, banning cafes. Men aren't allowed to speak to women. And then you see, Sharia law really take off and Wahhabism really become a thing and really proliferate. And the radicalization of Islam really take place in the 1980s. You also then see in 1985, the very first Hollywood movie, I believe it was called Delta Force, starring Chuck Norris. The first radical Islamic terrorist villain is in that movie. So then you see Hollywood beginning to gaslight the public as to these are the real bad guys. The Cold War is starting to wind down. And Russians are still featured throughout the 80s and 90s as villains in movies, but you really start to see radical Islamic terrorism becoming a thing. You also in 1977 have this other guy start his political career, and he starts writing all these books about terrorism and introducing the idea of terrorism to the public in the West, and equating it with Islam and saying that Islam is terrorism and terrorism is Islam. And that author's name was Benjamin Netanyahu. He was beginning his political career in Israel, and he wrote many, many books on terrorism, basically defined what terrorism is in the Western mind. And that was, of course, very huge hypocrisy, because in a lot of ways it was the Israelis who really brought terrorism to the Middle East in the 1930s, with the paramilitary groups that would ultimately become the IDF in 1949. So, but the really, really important moment, aside from the 1979 inflection point that I wanted to convey here, is what happens in 1979. And that's when King Faisal is murdered. And Faisal, by the way, just so people know, I mean, he, at like 13 years old, he's like in battle, like leading men in battle as like a 13-year-old. So this guy is not like some pushover who was, raised in like a palace. Like, he grew up in tents. He grew up in the desert. He was considered like a great warrior and the leader of men, even as like a teenager. So he was very, very respected among the Saudis, and somebody who actually was a true nationalist. And as far as I could tell, somebody who actually wanted to make Saudi Arabia great, because he didn't come from, the riches that some of his, some of the more like the descendants since them have come from, the opulence. He's killed in 1975 by his nephew, who had just come back actually from a long stay in Virginia, which is where I live. And that's where also the CIA headquarters is located. So there's a lot of conspiracy theories about, which I don't think are really theories, it's probably the truth, that this was an MK Ultra situation where his nephew was radicalized to kill him, and that's exactly what happened. So when Faisal was killed, I think you really start to see the Saudis, like the Saudi royal family. That's when they really start to, not that they weren't in bed with MI6 and the CIA before that, but you really start to see the bad actors in the family come into power and start to work really closely with the CIA. And the CIA, I think, takes a much more vested interest in MI6 and a much more vested interest in making sure that they have the control that they need over the family, because they learned, I think, from that experience that all it takes is one guy, one idealist coming into power who could really subvert their entire plan for whatever plan they had in the Middle East. And for that reason, I think that was a big reason that they were going to pivot away from Saudi Arabia and make sure that it wasn't going to be a factor in the future, and pivot more towards Iran. That I believe that's a big reason why they framed Saudi Arabia for 9/11. It's why I think they set up the PIF to go insolvent in 2017. And it's a big reason why Iran was propped up as like the new center of influence in the Middle East, because it's very obvious now that what they were going to do with the Abraham Accords, which is something that Donald Trump really did come up with, is they were going to unite the entire Sunni world. Let me just show you Sunni, Shia. So they were really going to unite the entire like Sunni Shia world against one another. So they're going to unite the Sunnis against unite them with Israel, and then lead them in a war against the Shia world. And just to give everyone an idea of what that looks like, here's a map just kind of showing you the Sunni Shia breakdown just in the Middle East. Jordan, of course, and Palestine are both Sunni. Iraq is kind of 50-50 with the Kurds up here. You have the Kurds up here, and so the Kurds are not Arabs, so there's dissent there. And that was, I think, a plan by the French and the English after World War I to draw these border lines right here to carve up Kurdistan. So you get Kurds in Turkey, Kurds in Iran, Kurds in Syria, and Kurds in Iraq. But Iraq is 50-50. It's basically 50% Shia, 50% Sunni, with also like the ethnic divide between Kurd, Arab, and even Persian. So Iraq, was considered kind of a Shia majority, but really they're a non-factor now that we've gone in there and just bombed it to hell after 9/11. They were kind of the one thing that was keeping Iran from going to war with everyone over here was Iraq. They've been removed now, and now that allows Iran and Israel to go to war. And if you get all the Sunnis on the same side of Israel, which is what the Abraham Accords did, now you can get the entire Muslim world outside of Iran to go to war with Iran. And then if you get other allies in the picture, you can see how that really easily becomes World War III. But as you pointed out to me, Matt, which is something that I didn't know, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I mentioned earlier, writes a book called The Grand Chessboard in 1998. And as you explained, he said the one thing that would subvert their plans for the Middle East would be if a triumvirate emerged between Iran, Russia, and China. And that's exactly what's happened. So when we talk about the sovereign alliance and just to give you a bigger picture, this is what the larger world looks like. You can see, only about 10 to 15% of the world is Shia, whereas most of the world, 85% plus of the Islamic world are Sunni. So you could really see how the world could rally around, like the Sunni world could rally around, Egypt, whoever it would have been, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, maybe Turkey being in NATO, to go to war against Iran. And this really could have easily developed into World War III. I don't think it's going to happen now. And the reason it's not going to happen is because in November of last year, you have after years of MBS during the Trump years, talking about how Iran was such a problem and they needed, and they were a real nemesis. You then have him in November of last year talking about how Iran can actually be a friend and they could actually go ahead and be friends with Iran. And so he then invites, at the time it was President Raisi to Riyadh, and Raisi comes to Riyadh and they meet. And for the first time, I think it was in 10 years that Iran and Saudi Arabia had relations, and he makes peace with them. So he makes peace with Iran. Iran and Saudi are now on the same, on the same page. They had an open line of communication. When you saw that whole thing develop between Israel and Iran, where they were exchanging missiles back in, I think it was April, I track the Saudi foreign ministry on a daily basis. I watch, like, who are they meeting with, and every single day they're flying people in and out of there. They're on the phone with allies around the world. They've done a really, really good job of cultivating these relationships, primarily in Europe, but all over the world. And I think they've leveraged those relationships in the past year to make sure that this October 7th thing didn't become anything more than a regional conflict. And you saw that the Iranian foreign minister was in constant contact with Riyadh, and he, especially around the time that they were doing this exchange of missiles. And when you saw the Iranian response to their embassy being bombed in Syria, it was really like a slap tickle fight, in my opinion. I mean, they sent like 300 missiles, I think it was. Nothing of real consequence was hit. No, like, civilians were injured, except for, I think, like, debris fell from one missile and hit a girl, and she went to the hospital. But aside from that, it wasn't like they were targeting civilian infrastructure or anything like that. So I think it was really more of just like a face saving exercise, so to speak. And now, just to that point, and then I'll kind of wrap it up because I know I've just been going nonstop. But something really interesting that we're seeing happen right now, Matt, and we've been talking about this a lot on Breaking History lately. So we've been talking about how you have, let me pull up this tab. Now you have the Islamic world all kind of coming together right now, and they are forming these alliances that did not exist before. You have Turkey making peace with Syria. Turkey and Syria have been at odds because when the Syrian civil war started back in 2012, Turkey, being a NATO member, they invaded, or they used proxy forces to invade northern Syria and took over territories on the border that they still hold to this day. And there's still animosity there, but they're at least now talking and working on diplomacy, which nobody saw coming. You have Egypt and Turkey now making amends. And the year before that, 2011, you had the Arab Spring, where, like, every single government in North Africa and the Middle East was engaged in a color revolution from the Muslim Brotherhood. You had the entire Western media and Turkey really promoting it and saying what a great thing this is. This is democracy in action. And really, it was just like a CIA color revolution, or MI6 color revolution, led by the Muslim Brotherhood, where they actually overthrow the Egyptian government for 2 years between 2011 and 2013. And Turkey was applauding it and saying this is great. And they were probably the ones behind it, maybe. And so that leads to animosity between Egypt and Turkey, and they haven't had relations since then. Since the Egyptians were able to launch a counter-insurgency in 2013, they retake control of their government, and they are then able to imprison the Muslim Brotherhood leaders who took over the government and put them on trial. And they haven't had a relationship with Turkey since then. They just signed a peace deal, or a memorandum of understanding, as they call it, I think a week or two ago, when the Egyptian president flies, Sisi, he's the guy who comes into power in 2013 when they do the counterinsurgency. He flies to Turkey and meets with Erdogan, and they make peace. And then finally, you have Turkey making peace with the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is 6 or 7 countries: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait, and Oman. And so they make peace with Saudi Arabia. So you have Saudi Arabia and Turkey making peace, Turkey and Egypt making peace, Turkey and Syria making peace. And at the same time, you have Turkey being courted by Vladimir Putin to join BRICS, to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization out of China. So you have the East now courting Turkey and saying, hey, we know you're a critical member of NATO, but we want you to work with us now and be friends with us. And Turkey has definitely been taking the bait and flirting back with them. And I think we're going to see that probably happen, which is upsetting a lot of people in the West, the right people, as you and I would view it. So the most breaking news now, Matt, that I'll share is, let me share my screen one last time before I open it up for questions. Share screen. We have... So now we talked about on Breaking History last week, Erdogan was calling for the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is the organization that we talked about before with 57 nations, to have an emergency meeting about Gaza and to figure out Gaza. At the same time this is happening, this is Monday and Wednesday of this past week. On Monday, we had Sergei Lavrov, who is the preeminent foreign diplomat in the world, comes to Riyadh, meets with MBS and Faisal bin Farhan, their the Saudi foreign minister, in Riyadh. You also, at the same time, they invited India to come in there. India is at that meeting. The entire Gulf Cooperation Council, those 6 or 7 countries I just mentioned, they're at those meetings with them. And it's important to remember that a few weeks ago, we had Modi, the leader of India, meeting with, he flew to Kiev for the first time ever, meets with Zelensky and kind of puts his arm around him. And it looks like they're having like a come to Jesus talk with Zelensky. So now you have India meeting with meeting with Russia in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And then 2 days later, you have the Chinese premier fly to Riyadh and do the exact same thing and meet with MBS, meet with Faisal bin Farhan, meet with all of them in Riyadh. So you have China and Russia in Riyadh within 48 hours of one another. After that first meeting on Monday, Faisal bin Farhan leaves the meeting, gets on a plane, flies to Egypt, and attends the Arab League annual meeting in Egypt, where all of the members of the Arab League were in Cairo. And at that time on Monday, that was when Erdogan came out and said, we have to have an OIC meeting to figure out what's going on with Gaza, because this is getting out of control. Which is, that's not new rhetoric out of Erdogan's mouth, but now we actually do have those. What's interesting is we actually do have that occurring. So yeah, if you can see my screen here, this is from Friday. We have a statement issued at a joint meeting of the implementation of the two-state solution held with the participation of His Highness, the Foreign Minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, and representatives of the Joint Ministerial Contact Group. So what he did, what this looks like this is the representatives of the Joint Ministerial Contact Group included the League of Arab States, the Arab League, the OIC, and a number of European countries. So you have Europe, the OIC, which is supposed to represent the entire Muslim world, and the Arab League all meeting together to talk about the two-state solution. And this was ostensibly, at least from a narrative standpoint, at the behest of Erdogan. So you see Erdogan, who is a critical member of NATO. And the reason that Turkey is a critical member of NATO is because you have to go through that strait in order to get to the Black Sea and get to Russia. So Turkey is a very, very important member of NATO. You and I have had Colonel Towner Watkins, who is the Operation Gladio expert, on our show. She's explained how Turkey is a major staging ground for not only NATO, but also Operation Gladio, which is used, the CIA program to overthrow governments. And now you have that guy kind of turning against the globalists and turning against the unipolar hegemony and trying to help what we would call the Sovereign Alliance organize against them. And so real quick, before I open it up, I'll just say that what we use to define the Sovereign Alliance is anyone who ostensibly seems to be standing up for sovereignty against the agenda to create a one world government. And that is a whole collection of people. And, whatever their character traits may be, their character flaws may be, we kind of set that aside because this is all about like an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation where, we might have cultural differences, we might have differences of opinion, but part of living in a multipolar world, which is what Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have openly talked about creating for a long time now, is understanding that we're going to have cultural differences, we're going to have differences of opinion, and we're not always going to agree on things. But it's not up to America or the State Department to export a certain culture to another part of the world. We have to respect the fact that we're going to govern ourselves and create our own culture. And that means we're going to disagree about the way sometimes we do things. But as long as we have common interests, common bonds, we can work together and not go to war. And I think it's important to keep in mind that's what the Sovereign Alliance is all about. It's not about, painting this picture of like everyone in the Sovereign Alliance is, a good guy and a perfect angel who's never done anything wrong. It's about, are you promoting peace or are you promoting World War III? And that, at the end of the day, is my litmus test. So with that said, I'll kind of open it up for any feedback or questions. I know I've been talking for a long time.
Gordon, that was great, man. Now that's exactly what I was hoping for, and I'm sure that this is going to fuel some good conversation. And I mean, the way I sort of see this as well, you've painted a really good picture, is that we've got a very complex bomb with multiple triggers that has been set to go off, and you have people who on one level want it to go off, or at least are insane enough to think that they can come out on top or through this multi-layered explosion. On the other hand, you actually have very serious adults in the room who are trying to defuse this thing, and there's multiple fuses with Gordian knots on Gordian knots built into this thing, but they're going about it in a very systemic way, building the framework to start resolving these contradictions that are designed to be in the system. And if they're not resolved in a careful way, using a very, very wise, high-level quality of philosophical insight, it will blow up in our faces, and civilization could come undone for many generations. So it's really good that you just did what you did. And I think that there are people, for all of their flaws, like you said, representing different cultures of the world, who don't want to have that on their conscience, that they played a role in undermining thousands of years of human civilization. They don't want to live with that. So very good. There's a couple of questions here. Monty was the first to get in with his digital hand. Everybody, please pop your either digital hand up or write your name in the chat box, and I'll call upon you if you want to share a thought or ask a question to Gordon. So Monty, it's yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, and really appreciate the work you're doing both on this channel, Gordon, but also Badlands Media. I follow you very closely, and it's a go-to every week for me. I'm most impressed with I was in Afghanistan and Iraq for 4 years, so I had a kind of a firsthand view of things. And I'm very much impressed with your outlining of this reconciliation between the Sunni and the Shia. And really, it's been facilitated by this idea of the BRICS, Russia and China. I think this BRICS was started probably 20 years ago, but it's really evolving now and culminating in this upcoming meeting in Gaza in Russia this next month, which even more people, which will represent the global maturity. But what I'm impressed by is this contradiction, this idea of the sovereign alliance you were calling to, and seeing a world historic, as a world historic event, at least an epic event. And what I'm reminded of in coming together around BRICS and everything, and the Sunnis and Shia coming together with their so-called irreconcilable differences, but they're finding a common interest in development and mutual benefit of people. I'm reminded of another sovereign alliance in the early 15th century, 1422, in which in the Council of Florence, 1422, under Nicholas Acusa, that also brought together people with vast differences, religious and otherwise, which came together in Florence around a common principle, which was described as imago viva Dei, or capax Dei, the capacity to do good on earth, under a common idea, which was demonstrated through pedagogical devices such as squaring of the circle and Nicholas Acusa as a proof of principle of man existing in the image and likeness of God. So much like that, and that came out of a dark age, right, where England and defaulted on a debt and the whole monetary system fell, and there was a prolonged period of a dark age, wars, famine, pestilence, and disease. So I'm seeing what's happening today with that potential. I'm seeing what's happening is a potential for a new renaissance, just like the Council of Florence born a new renaissance. And would you have that same view of it? And I have a follow-up question at the end, if it's time has avails itself. Thank you.
Of course. That's such a great question, and that is something that I didn't really get to touch on here, but I did mention last time, Matt, that I came on and we had a talk. Another thing that's I think is really important to for me to evaluate when I'm looking at, you know, what are the motivations of these leaders is are they using war and conquest as the vehicle for establishing their power or establishing consensus among their neighbors, which is really coercion, like that's what war would be, or are they using something different like economic prosperity, which is exactly what I'm seeing out of MBS. So MBS, he has a vision. He calls it Vision 2030, and I won't tell the whole story, but he goes to meet with Obama in 2016, April of 2016, with his father. And they think they're going to be speaking to MBS's father about Iran and about the Iran nuclear deal. And really, it just kind of like Salman just turns it over to MBS, and he just starts talking about this big idea he has about making Saudi Arabia and really the Middle East the next Europe, and just saying, we want to have this renaissance. We want to have this major economic prosperity development. We want to have high-speed rail. I want to make like Silicon Valley 2.0 in Saudi Arabia. We want to be in high tech, all this stuff. And Obama basically just spits in his face and is like, I think this kid's lying to me. This kid is obviously hiding something. Why is he even talking? He's like 30 years old. Why is he even talking in this meeting? Completely disrespects him. And I think that really leaves a bad taste in MBS's mouth about Obama and about, you know, the State Department. And another reason why I think he was so excited when Donald Trump came into office, because Donald Trump is the perfect president, the perfect American leader to achieve exactly what MBS wants to achieve. And you may have seen like a month ago or 2 months ago, it was announced that the next Trump Tower is going to be in Saudi Arabia. They're going to build a Trump Tower in Saudi Arabia, which is exactly what MBS wants to do. He wants to develop the coastline in the Red Sea and make it, in his words, the next French Riviera. So I think he's kind of teasing or dangling out this carrot in front of everyone in the Middle East and saying, look what we can do. We have this great opportunity to work together. Like, we can all get rich, and we don't have to kill each other to do it. We don't have to go the old way of war and conquest in order to acquire vast wealth. We can do it through working together, through cooperation, and do what Europe did many centuries ago, and have kind of this enlightenment period. But the only way we're going to achieve that is if we stop killing each other. We can't have forever wars. We can't let the CIA and MI6 come in here and kick the hornet's nest every few years. We got to get rid of all of them. And that means getting rid of all the people who, by the way, did 9/11, which is what, when he was 16 years old, said he vowed he was going to do. So I think it's really important to understand that his vision for what he wants to achieve, and as of right now, they are set to host the World's Fair in 2030. They have this major plan for what that's going to be, where every single country gets their own pavilion, and every single country comes to Riyadh and showcases what their big inventions are, just like we did, we used to do a century ago. And then I think they're trying to host the World Cup. It's either in 2032 or 2034, which is between those two events. That's going to be like Saudi Arabia's coming out party and like reintroducing themselves to the world as a major economic leader, where it's like, this is not the Saudi Arabia that you used to think we are. This is a different Saudi Arabia. But I think a big part of that is rebranding themselves as everything that Fox News told us that you are. We are not that thing anymore.
Did you want to quickly pose your follow-up, Monty, or are you good?
Do the other questions first, because it's a little bit off topic, but not really off topic. It relates to yeah.
Okay, we'll circle back. All right, cool. Yeah, and I appreciate what you're saying. I think it's important that people, I know a lot of people are a little bit utopian and that's part of just our culture, and having been, exposed to a lot of Hollywood narratives of the clear-cut good guys versus the clear-cut bad guys. And it's like good and evil are so overly simplified to a point that your brain doesn't really understand the nature of either one of those two things by virtue of just this type of simplistic cultural programming. And people get frustrated that, but China or Trump or Saudi Arabia, they're doing something that might seem useful, but they want to make money. Or a lot of the businessmen are doing things because they want to make money or something. So it's like people get very jaded and black pilled. Like, oh, that means human beings are corrupt. The players are corrupt. And it's like, well, no, sometimes you realize in history that you will make more money by not engaging in killing all of your customers. Um,
Yes.
and you know, there are philosopher kings out there who think on that higher level who are not animated by material possessions. They're very few in number, and they always have been, who are the creative grand strategists. But a lot of the people who need to work with and organize are not at that level, and are at that level where they do want to make money and they also want to survive. They don't want to get blown up necessarily in a nuclear war. So these are the people that are being put into motion to organize a variety of back channel discussions, business deals, and as you just pointed out, turning Saudi Arabia to the new French Riviera. Will make a lot of money for a lot of people, but guaranteed it's going to be a lot more profitable than killing off 90% of the world population. That's just common sense business that we used to have in the West that we lost in the last decade. So it's good to get back in touch with this idea that capitalism is not intrinsically an evil if you don't have a death cult managing a society and the so-called capital in play. But I just appreciated how you just shape that nuance just there.
Of course.
Susie Hoffman has written down a little question, but I'm guessing, Susie, your microphone probably works. Do you want to just pose your question, or you want me to read it? All right, I'll just read it. It's more of a commentary that sort of touches on what Monty had just said. He said, she senses that what you were describing is almost like a new Treaty of Westphalia that they are working on, is it not?
Yeah, I actually think that's a really fair comparison. And for people who aren't familiar, the Treaty of Westphalia was from the 17th century, the mid 1600s, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it was at the end of the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War was a pretty major war between Catholicism, basically, and the Protestants, where you had wars over religion, basically, not only between the Vatican and the Protestants, but also among the Protestants as well, where there was just a lot of strife, internal strife about the nuance of Christianity, which now in hindsight seems a little silly. Like it seems like it's very, very highly nuanced, right? Like it's almost too nuanced in comparison to where we are now in the world. But yeah, I think it's a really, really fair comparison, because I think we are looking at a situation where differences are being put aside in order to come together and allow prosperity to be achieved. And by the way, I just wrote a article in for the Badlands News Brief on Friday, because everyone on Thursday was posting about the Battle of Vienna from 1683, where the Winged Hussars came in and saved Vienna from a major horde of Ottoman invaders. And again, that's another situation where the truth isn't really being fully presented, because they always like to present it as like a Christianity versus Islam, and to some extent it was. Of course, it was really more empire versus empire. But a major component of the cavalry charge that saved Vienna, and for those who aren't familiar with it, it is, I believe, the event that inspired the scene at the end of the final Lord of the Rings movie, where the orcs are attacking the city, and then the Rohirrim come in, and like that's exactly what happened. You had 150,000 Ottomans besieging the city of Vienna, and then 18,000 cavalry come in, led by 3,000 Winged Hussars from Poland, and take them all out. And a major component of that were these guys called the Liptka Tartars, who were an all-Muslim unit maintained by Poland. They were descendants of the Golden Horde, which I've been writing about a week or two ago, when Russia was meeting in Mongolia with the Mongolians. And basically they came into Poland and they taught the Polish all about their mastery of horses, because the Mongolians were absolute masters when it came to horses. And then you had this other group of Serbs who were expelled from Hungary in the mid 1500s. And they go into Poland and they create a mercenary group that then becomes the Winged Hussars. So the Winged Hussars were actually created by, I believe, Serbian Muslims. And they're now completely affiliated as like a Christian. They're like they're thought of, they're equated by, you know, people on X as like this Christian group, and maybe they were. I'm not highly familiar with like all their intricacies, but my understanding is that they were founded by a group of Serbs that were exiled from Hungary in the 1500s. So a little bit of nuance there, but that whole situation is set up by the Treaty of Westphalia, which was, you know, a few decades before.
Interesting. Didn't you also bring up to me how the Winged Hussars somehow were connected or played a role in the American Revolution? Is that a memory?
Yeah, I included that in the write-up as well. So in 1772, so 90 years after that event happens, the Winged Hussars save Vienna from the Ottomans. And that victory over the Ottomans is considered the beginning of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. That was the peak of the Ottoman Empire. And then from there, it just starts to decline. They lose World War I, and then it gets chopped up into the map we were looking at earlier. And that's where like Turkey, Syria, they all like stop getting along at that point. 1772, partition of Poland. Benjamin Franklin is in Europe, engaged in diplomacy. He goes to the leader of the Hussars. At that point, they're not wearing the wings anymore, so they're just the Hussars. And he says, "Hey, you don't have a country at this point. Why don't you come to America and help George Washington fight the British Empire?" And so Casimir Pulaski, he does. He brings a few of his horse lords with him. At that point, George Washington has no experience with cavalry, because all of his military experience comes from the French and Indian War, which was fought in the mountains of Canada in the northern colonies, where they didn't really use cavalry as set pieces. So he doesn't even know how to use cavalry, but the British do, and the British use them very effectively. And so Pulaski comes in with his guys, and they are masters of cavalry, and they basically do all these demonstrations for George Washington, explain to him how important cavalry is. It takes like 4 or 5 months to really convince Congress to give him an officer's commission. They finally give him an officer's commission in September of 1777. And then the first battle that he goes into, the Battle of Brandywine, the Continental Army is surrendering. They're like yielding to the British cavalry, and George Washington is surrounded and about to be killed. And Pulaski like rallies all of George Washington's like personal bodyguard and all these other guys, leads this massive cavalry charge, saves George Washington's life, turns the battle, averts this like huge disaster, which would have been a major blow to the cause, and basically saves the American Revolution to some extent with that battle. Goes on to do the same thing in many other battles, a lot of successful battles, and then is killed in a cavalry charge in 1779 at the Battle of Savannah. And he's now considered the father of the U.S. cavalry. Like, he's the guy who created the U.S. cavalry. So it's like the Winged Hussars almost become the U.S. because he taught the Americans everything they knew about cavalry. And so the Winged Hussars almost kind of become the U.S. cavalry.
Bloody fantastic. Great. Kelly has a question about Israel.
Yeah.
Kelly, are you there?
Hey, Gordon.
Hey, Kelly.
Yeah, your knowledge of Eastern European history, it's just impeccable.
Thank you.
Yeah, I look forward to watching your weekly show with Matt there, the Breaking History. It's there's always something interesting, easy to follow. Anyways, we're talking about the Middle East here. You didn't mention much about Israel. Like, there, it's like a big knot in that whole Middle East scenario.
Yep.
With like Netanyahu, like they seem to hate everybody, all their neighbors. They just hate everybody. And you know, I've been hearing about this for years and years and years. It's like there's no solution to like why they can't live together.
Yeah.
What's going on? And then as well as like Hamas,
Mm-hmm.
like I understand, like Hamas it's not even a genuine rebel force.
No, it's not. You're 100% right. It's not. So Hamas was created in 1988, which I believe is the same year that Al Qaeda was created. And that also happened to be the same year that Yasser Arafat declared Palestine like a sovereign nation. Like I said, we're going to establish a sovereign nation. That's when he kind of begins to seek a peaceful solution with Israel, like a two-state solution, which 5 years later leads to the 1993 Oslo Accords. And that was where Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas, who's the current president of Palestine, goes to the Clinton White House. They sign a peace deal. They meet for the first time in public with the Israeli leadership. They sign an agreement with Yitzhak Rabin. Saying Yitzhak Rabin was a general from the IDF who fought Yasser Arafat for many, many years. And in their old age, they both decided that, you know, if we don't resolve this, then all we're doing is leaving our children to kill each other the same way we killed each other for decades. And so kind of the wisdom of their twilight years comes through. And part of the agreement was that Yasser Arafat's group, the Palestine Liberation Organization, leaves or like departs from or exits the government of Palestine, and this new group, the Palestinian Authority, led by the Fatah faction, which is Mahmoud Abbas, they then take over and they seek this peaceful situation with Israel. And so the plan was between 1993 and I think it was 1999. Israel was going to pull all of its military out of the West Bank and out of Gaza. That was the plan. That it did not end up happening. And the reason it did not happen is because Yitzhak Rabin, 2 years after the signing of the agreement, is murdered by a Jewish terrorist. Another guy, just like King Faisal, a Jewish Israeli citizen who went to America and came back and was radicalized and kills him. Some of the guys who were involved in that group too, who were like friends of this guy, are all now cabinet members of Netanyahu's government, including Ben Gvir. Ben Gvir was actually on television, like threatening Yitzhak Rabin like 2 weeks before he was killed. And so that was when Netanyahu becomes prime minister. He'd already been in politics before then. He was the foreign minister in 1990. So he was already in politics, but he becomes the prime minister in 95 after Rabin is killed. And that at the same time, you also have the Refuseniks, who are the, as they call them, the Russian Jews, came in after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They form a political party in 1995. They run for office. They win Knesset seats. And then later in 2003, they actually merged their party with the Likud party, with Netanyahu's party. And that was also at the same time in the 2000s. You have confidential cables being sent in the State Department saying, "Hey, we're really worried that the the Ukrainian mafia, because these guys were all from, they call them Russian Jews, but they're all from Ukraine. This Ukrainian mafia has taken over like the Israeli government." That's what they were saying, and that's ostensibly seems to be what occurred, is that you had the Russian/Ukrainian/Israeli mafia. Not to say that Israel didn't have problems before that, or that it didn't have nefarious actors there before, but I think this kind of took it up to the next level, because you see in the 90s and the 2000s this gangland war occurring between these mafia members and the Israeli security forces inside of Israel. And these guys are establishing this network not only in Israel and in Ukraine, but you also, the third location is Brighton Beach, New York. And Brighton Beach is apparently just a complete Ukrainian neighborhood, where if you go there, it's like everyone there is Ukrainian, Israeli, Ukrainian, Jewish, whatever. And that's where like the Israeli mafia operates out of, is Brighton Beach. And so between those three locations, you have this major like drug trafficking operation where these guys become the primary providers for the Gambino crime family, for their ecstasy pills. It's a major human trafficking hub. You have these organ trafficking operations happening in Ukraine that seem to be connected to Israel. So a lot of really nefarious stuff that like you may or may not have heard about or read about. But from my reading on all this, I mean, there's plenty of problems that I have with the founding of Israel and the people who were involved in that, like Jabotinsky, Netanyahu's father, who was his secretary. Matt and I have talked about a lot of that stuff. So we can talk about the problem with the proto-Zionists and the actual Zionists who go in and create the nation of Israel, which they do, by the way, with the help of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. That they help with the Havar Transfer Agreement of 1933 immigrate, Jewish people from Eastern and Central Europe to Palestine. That happens mostly in the 1930s. Which no one ever talks about. No one also talks about how Mossad had hired some of the top Nazi intelligence officers, guys who were best friends with Adolf Hitler, who were very close to Adolf Hitler, go to then work for Mossad after World War II. No one ever talks about that. So there seems to be this connection between the Third Reich and Israel that no one ever talks about. There's a connection certainly between the Third Reich and modern Ukraine, the modern Ukrainian government, and NATO. So you really start to see this nefarious element between those things: Israel, Ukraine, NATO, and the U.S. government, of course. So to your question, can this thing be resolved? Can it be fixed? That remains to be seen. I think ultimately what it comes down to is the will of the Israeli people. Are there enough good, decent people in Israel? I've certainly met good, decent people from Israel, so I know those people exist. But are there enough of them to overthrow? To throw these people out and bring in good government, institute good government that actually earnestly wants peace? The same question, by the way, can be asked of America. Like, are there enough good, decent people in America to throw this parasite that we have in DC out and institute a new form of government? It certainly feels like there's enough people in America. What ultimately ends up happening remains to be seen. But I think it's a parallel situation where ultimately I don't think it's up to the United States, Donald Trump, us, or even MBS in Saudi Arabia to fix Israel. I think it's up to the Israeli people to do it. Now, can they do it? I hope so, and I pray that they do. What I've seen happen from Saudi Arabia, what I'm seeing out of Saudi Arabia, number one, holding back all the Muslims back in October was so important, because I do think that the plan was to provoke the Muslim world into striking Israel, which then would have given them the justification to strike back, and that would have started World War III. That didn't happen, and I think that was the whole point. I think MBS said, this is exactly what they want us to do. We're not going to do it. And so there's a lot of animosity among Muslims I've seen online towards MBS, because they view him as like a puppet of Netanyahu, or they see him a puppet of Israel, or they see him as even really, really good analysts like Scott Ritter, who I think has provided some good intel on Ukraine and Russia. When I hear him talk about Israel and Saudi Arabia, he talks about how the Saudis don't like the Palestinians and how they actually prefer the Israelis, and they want this whole thing to be done. I don't see it that way. I see it, as I said, going back originally, I think MBS is on a giant revenge arc. I mean, you can call it justice, but a giant justice arc against the perpetrators of 9/11. And I view Bibi Netanyahu as one of the central players in the 9/11 psyop. And so I view him at the very top of MBS's hit list of people he wants to take out. But he has to do it in a very smart way, because he can't just come out and ostensibly do it the way that you would expect. He has to do it more politically, which is why I think he's been hyper-focused on building these alliances throughout Europe, throughout Asia, throughout Africa, and even in America, where the world now, I think, really prefers him over Netanyahu. He's done this in a very peaceful, diplomatic way, building bilateral relations with all these people. And I think that he's leveraging all those relationships now against Israel and against the Netanyahu regime to try to drive them out of power, because the worst thing that could happen, I think, right now would be for this major war to occur, because going back to the beginning of this discussion, it seems that Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons. And if they are backed into a corner and feel that they are facing their existential demise, they may decide to launch those weapons in every direction and kill everybody. I mean, we've seen the psychotic rhetoric coming out of some of the people in Netanyahu's government. I wouldn't put it past them to do that, even against the United States and Britain, who are like their benefactors, right, or their financial backers. It wouldn't surprise me that that's their strategy. They're almost holding a gun to some people's heads and saying, "You better back us or else." That might be what's happening. I don't have anything to necessarily confirm that, other than just theories, regarding the what's it called? The
Sampson.
Sampson option. Yeah, the Sampson option, which may or may not be true. There's certainly people in the Israeli government who've come out and said that it's true, and it's real. So, how do you, to Matt's point, how do you untangle this Gordian knot? How do you do this in a way that minimizes death? I mean, because what's happening in Gaza is obviously awful. It's horrible, like the stories that are coming out of there, and we all want it to stop immediately. So the question that people have is, well, why is MBS and the UAE, helping get supplies to Israel and feed them while Yemen and the Houthis are, embargoing them and succeeding in cutting off their supply lines? Because as our friend Warhamster has explained to us on Breaking History before, Israel is completely dependent on importing food and resources in order to survive. It can't survive without its import-export business. So why not just cut them off and basically starve them out? And the answer is because if you do that, then they might nuke everybody, like potentially. So, there's also the optics of, the humanitarian and the Arabs, which I think a lot of Western analysts didn't expect. They didn't expect the Arabs to step up and make sure that the people of Israel were getting food and everything while the people of Palestine are being starved by the Israelis. So I do think there's a lot of diplomatic strategic games that are being played to try to win over support around the world. And I do think at this point, support is being won around the world. I mean, we're seeing right now Dmitry Medvedev. Yeah, thank you. It's very hard for me to pronounce his name. Who, as I understand it, Matt, is he was like the anti-Putin. Like, he not anti-Putin meaning he opposed Putin, but meaning that he was like the pro-West, pro-globalist, like the friend of the West who was in power in Russia as the president from 2008 to 2012. He's now coming out and saying that Russia should start bombing Britain and start going after Britain in the West. Like, so whatever sympathies he had towards the globalists and towards the people in the West, the leaders, I mean, that's all evaporated. And he is now like all in on going after those people, which, by the way, is what I think Putin is now saying too. He's saying that if you are going to allow Zelensky to strike deep into Russia with these long range missiles, we're going to come after all of you. And I don't think Putin's the kind of guy who's going to like bomb a city in the United States or like go after the U.S. military, which is only going to provoke escalation. I think he's more likely to start going after like these nefarious leaders, the people who are like hell bent on destroying Russia.
Yeah, I get the sense that Medvedev has sort of taken on the role of bad cop.
Yeah, exactly.
Where you have level-headed people like Lavrov and Putin sort of being the voice of calm reason in general, although they can also make their red lines very well known. But I'm a little undecided overall about Medvedev's true heart at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I know he participated in a near coup overthrowing Putin back in January of 2020. There was like an attempted rebellion that he was a part of. And maybe, maybe he was always an insider working with Putin to subvert some of these liberal fascist fifth columnists. Maybe that's the case. Maybe he's tried to save his ass and has taken on this new, he's chosen to play ball as many traitors have who have learned their lesson, being tools for the West. And maybe he actually is playing this self-aware bad cop as part of this this reverse psychological warfare with the Western technocrats. I hope that that's the case. I feel that that's the case, but I'm open to other possibilities. But all that to say, yeah.
Well, look at what happened with Prigozhin of the Wagner Group, right? Like, I don't believe that guy's dead. That's the guy that's the guy who got in the airplane crash, who was like leading the coup against Putin like a year ago, and he was like, he got in the airplane to like go lead the coup, and then the airplane crashes, and it's like, oh well, he's dead. I don't think that guy's dead at all. And then when you look at like what the Wagner Group has been doing in Africa since 2018, where they've been like overthrowing all these globalist regimes throughout Africa, and then helping to transfer the oil rights and the mineral rights away from the globalist oligarchy and into the hands of China, UAE, Russia, Saudi Arabia, all these other players. It's very encouraging with the Wagner Group seems like the tip of the spear in terms of the actual kinetic conflict between the globalists and the Sovereign Alliance. And primarily that's in Ukraine right now, but they've been in Syria since 2012 maybe. And they've been in Africa since 2018. So Africa, Syria, and Ukraine, the Wagner group has been in there fighting, the globalists.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's very important to educate the mind's eye to not rely on necessarily literal feedings of information that we're given from either mainstream or alternative press, because there's a higher battle going on that only the mind can triangulate in on by taking this historical context, these lessons about human nature and how real statecraft actually happens throughout history, that then inform us into how decisions are being made for good and for bad, conspiracies for the good as well as for the bad behind the scenes. So yeah, very good points. We have time for maybe two more. We have Minaka, who just threw in a request to pose a question, and then we have a follow-up from Monty, and then we'll probably round it out at that point. So Minaka, it's all yours. You're on mute, by the way. You have to unmute your Zoom.
Hi, hello. That was really a comment and then a question. Yeah, I found that really interesting, Gordon, because a lot of it's made me like challenge some of my beliefs about Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, actually, because I was maybe guilty of thinking some of the things that you said, that you said some people who haven't maybe explored it fully might think, which was I was perhaps quite condemning of their view, their support for Israel in terms of the genocide in Gaza, and that I felt they hadn't really stepped up enough and stood by the people of Palestine. But it sounds from what you're saying that you feel they're playing a longer game and that it's quite strategic. Is that right?
Yes, and the main thing that makes me think that is the fact that I recently learned, or relatively recent, maybe like a year ago, learned about this interview that happened between Donald Trump and this Israeli journalist named Barak Ravid in December of 2021. And it was an audio interview where Trump was on the phone. He was talking to this guy, and it only got released on the Israeli media, like Israeli Channel 12, I think, released it. And then Barak Ravid wrote a book about it. And so there are a few headlines out there that talked about this, but other than that, it really didn't get reported in the Western media. And what Trump told him is that he between 2018 and 2020, basically, Israel didn't have a government, or at least a consistent government. They failed to form a coalition government for like 3 years, where elections kept getting held. Either Netanyahu would win the election, or this other guy, Benny Gantz, would win the election. And then either one would fail to actually form their consensus government, the coalition government. And so then they have to call new elections. And that happened for many years until COVID came along. And then they decided, Benny Gantz agreed to put aside their differences, form an emergency government where Netanyahu got all the power, and kind of the rest is history. And so this is, 2 years later, like a year and a half after that. Trump is telling this guy, I don't understand why Netanyahu's still in power. Like, Netanyahu was supposed to retire. He was supposed to ride off into the sunset. Benny Gantz was supposed to come in. I loved Benny Gantz. I thought Benny Gantz was great. Benny Gantz, he's the guy that I was backing the whole time. And he's the guy, by the way, who would have made peace with Palestine. Like, I don't think Netanyahu ever wanted peace. I think Benny Gantz actually would have pursued peace. And so the fact that he's not in power right now really is a head scratcher for me. And this is like 3 years ago that he said this. And so I think that Netanyahu I think there's a counterinsurgency being launched against him, but also the oligarchy that he represents. And I think the whole point of this being dragged out is, again, to motivate the Israeli people to rise up against them, which, if you look at the images online right now, there's like 500,000 people in the streets of Tel Aviv demanding Netanyahu to resign. So it seems like that's metastasizing into something very, very tangible. And so hopefully it comes to fruition. But I don't know if Benny Gantz is actually a good guy or not. But it seems like at the very least, Trump is using Benny Gantz as a vehicle to leverage against Netanyahu. I mean, it could be Benny Gantz is just as bad as Netanyahu, but at least from a narrative standpoint, Trump has told the Israeli people that Netanyahu is bad news, and they need somebody like Benny Gantz in there to make peace with Palestine. So,
All right, my mother has a question. My grandmother, they're listening to this live together on why do you think that Canadian and U.S. Iranians tend to, and I would say tend to, hate Iran so much? And I say tend to because I've met some patriots as well, but it's true. There's a disproportionately large number that I've met in across Canada and the U.S. who have very negative feelings towards Iran as part of the expat community. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Iran. Like I've always kind of described Iran, both Iran and Turkey, as like an enigma, and I think Erdogan continues to kind of play that role of enigma. It's like it's hard to really get a grasp on what they are. Obviously, they've had a historically, been a bad player, a bad actor. They've probably been controlled by bad Western intelligence forces, CIA types. But we've also seen in the past few years them not assume the role that we would have expected them to assume and accelerate war. I mean, Iran has had every opportunity to start a war with Israel and they haven't done it yet. And the question is, why haven't they done it? And obviously, you also see the alliance between Iran and Russia. Now, why do Iranians hate Iran? Probably because you have a CIA puppet government running Iran, at least for many, many decades. And I can't speak to specifics like as to what's actually happening on the ground in Iran because I'm not there. So I don't really blame people for having negative feelings towards Iran. I mean, there's a very good chance that the way Iran's been run has not been positive for people who live there. But what I'm seeing develop now is at least there seems to be a resistance to the CIA and to the agenda of what we would have expected from them. And I mean, the fact that they're aligned with Putin and Xi over, the Netanyahus and World Economic Forum types of the world is very encouraging. So, I mean, it seems like that they are at least positioning themselves to be anti-globalist. And I find that encouraging. Now, what's actually happening on the ground with the regime there is a separate question. And whether there needs to be a new government there as well is another question. But as far as this quote unquote sovereign alliance goes, I'm just looking at it through a lens of who's opposing the agenda to establish a centralized one world government.
Yeah. Yeah, and who does the oligarchy clearly want to destroy? And it's not hard to see that Iran has a big fat target on its head, and it's had it for many years as a key trophy of regime change and destruction. So that's also a factor in considerations. Thank you. And yes, my mother and grandmother also say perfect thank you. They are satisfied with your answer.
Of course.
Monty, I'm going to give it to you for the last question. Go for it.
All right. Thank you very much. And I've been itching to ask you this question for many months now, Gordon, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to do so. And it relates to your last Badlands presentation with Matt, where you were talking about resolving paradoxes and this idea, which I think you presented very clearly on the fact that democracy killed Socrates.
Mm-hmm.
And in line with that, I would like to even take it a couple steps further. And this relates to why is it we tolerate genocide? And why is it we even tolerate the idea of nuclear Armageddon, which really would be genocide and human sacrifice on a worldwide scale? So why is that? And like you mentioned, the Sampson option. So many people kind of ascribe it to AIPAC. Okay, they have such influence money-wise.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's legitimately part of the problem. But however, there's one pastor in Montana named Chuck Baldwin who comes out with this, and he goes after Christian Zionists like Jesus did in the temple with the whips and overturning the tables. And he comes right out and says the real problem is this idea of Christian Zionism, which really came from Darby and Schofield, which really empowers all this. And it's kind of like most Christians, good Christians, smiley face Christians, just tolerate it and go along with it, this ideology.
Yeah.
And drilling down deeper with this, I would propose that this idea of human sacrifice, which you also brought up in your last presentation, supposedly that was done away with when Abraham had this recognition, right, that human sacrifice was bad. However, it appears to me that it was resurrected with this myth, and I'm not sure where it came from, this preposterous lie that God ordained Jesus to come down to be a human sacrifice in order to save humankind, which was really the basis for the Christian Zionist, premillennialist, apocalyptic, dispensationalist belief system. And I would say, take a look what actually happened, at least the record that we have of what actually happened when the Pharisees and the scribes, right, they set this thing up because Jesus was basically a threat to them. So they set the thing up. And they came to Pontius Pilate, and many people ascribe it to him as being responsible. But if you look at the record, supposedly he washed his hands of it. He said, behold the man, right? He literally washed his hands of it and said, I don't, So he said, I'll tell you what, who do you want me to release? Barabbas or Christ?
Yep.
And it was democracy that shouted to crucify Christ. So in reality, not only did democracy kill Socrates, but in my mind, it's the same with Christ. And I think that's why we tolerate this stuff, because we have this idea still that God somehow ordains humans to be sacrificed. That's a price that we have to pay because of our sins or whatever the hell it is. So could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, well, it's even more nefarious than that, because what Pilate said is he said, who do you want me to release, Barabbas or Jesus? And thinking that they're going to say, well, obviously release Jesus because Barabbas is a scumbag, and everyone knew he was a scumbag. And then what the Pharisees apparently did is they went through the crowd and they told everybody to say teacher in Aramaic, which in Aramaic, apparently teacher is Bar-Abbas. So everyone in the crowd is shouting out, release the teacher, release Bar-Abbas. And so everyone's shouting out Barabbas, and Pilate, being a Roman, hears Barabbas, and he's like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm giving you the option to save your guy, and you're shouting out to save the other guy. He doesn't realize that they're all shouting out teacher in their language. And that's what I've read. I mean, whether or not that's 100% true, but that's at least what I've read. And so that's when he says, I'm washing my hands of this. Like, I don't want anything to do with this. I don't have a problem with Jesus. He seems like, he thinks he's God, but other than that, I mean, he seems like a perfectly nice guy. You can have my guards, you can have my Romans to do what you want with him, Pharisees, but I'm out. Like Rome is pulling out of this. And that's basically what happened, is that, as I understand it, is that Rome kind of backed out of it. They gave their guys to Judea, to the Pharisees, in order to do whatever they wanted to do with these people. But yeah, I mean, and then of course it gets twisted. I mean, in the Bible, in multiple places, it says the Pharisees killed him. It says the Pharisees were the ones who killed him. But of course, if you ask Christian Zionists, they'll tell you that it was Rome who killed him. I mean, I was raised to believe that Rome killed him. That's kind of I think the Schofield Bible was the one that kind of first like twisted all that. But again, it's like that. A lot of that's just theology and like theological discussions. As like your question about democracy, direct democracy. I mean, democracy is mob rule. And that was something that I think a lot of these philosophers were figuring out, that mob rule is dangerous and it can very easily be twisted. And that's a perfect example. It's like the Pharisees going through, if that story's true, the Pharisees going through and telling everyone to say something that they knew was going to, then they go to Pilate and say, see, they're saying Barabbas, like release Barabbas. And Pilate is so like beside himself that the people would have picked Barabbas over Jesus that he decides to wash his hands of the whole situation. Yeah, I mean, that was a big reason why the founding fathers went with the representational government, the republic, over democracy, because democracy, even if it's like, oh, we're going to use the patriarch of every household or the patriarch of every whatever community to vote on it, so it's not a direct democracy, that's not good enough. It's got to be people electing a representative to then go serve their interests in a centralized government. So there's a barrier between the people and the actual lawmaking, because people can't always be trusted. Mob rule can't always be trusted because emotions can inflame mob rule.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank y'all, guys. I really appreciate it. My kids are waking up right now, so I probably got to jump
just
off.
Quickly, how do people reach you? How do they read your stuff?
The best way to reach me, I haven't been posting as much as I normally have the past few weeks because I've had a lot of family stuff going on. But X, Ghost of BPH on X, Ghost of Base Patrick Henry on X. But the best place to read my stuff is on the Badlands Substack. If you just go to Google or whatever and type in Badlands Substack and the Badlands Media Substack, I write for the news brief every single day. So Monday through Friday, we put out a news brief, and I always put normally 2 to 3 takes on news articles in there.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you so much for everybody for coming by, sharing these ideas. And again, Gordon's up his takes. I really value these things. Every couple of days, these Badlands briefs come out, and Gordon's analysis is top notch. So yeah, definitely subscribe to that, follow it. Gordon, thank you. Next week, we're going to have David Gosselin going through some stuff on geopolitical warfare and epistemology as well. So that'll be next Sunday at 2 p.m. Thank you all, and thank you, Gordon.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Matt. Talk soon.